So welcome, Paul. It's our first opportunity to have a conversation with a journalist in this series of interviews. And I'm aware that we're doing that at a time when the profession of journalist is changing dramatically and under a lot of pressure, or assume it is, and we'll be asking you about that. So it's a great privilege, Paul Handley of the Church Times, to have you here with us. And Paul, if I might begin by saying you've demonstrated a remarkable pedigree and staying power in your career as a journalist and at the Church Times that we're looking forward to unpacking. So Paul, could we begin by you telling us which issue of the Church Times you first edited?
Sure. Let me just first say this is all very odd because it's right. The wrong way around for me. I'm used to interviewing people rather than being interviewed. So
really great. Okay.
If we swap halfway through, I think the people who are listening will be really interested.
You have me very nervous about you can tell me how good a job I do or not.
Okay. I mean, the first issue I edited was February something 1995. So
right. I have it down as the 10th of February 1995.
There we are. There we go. As you see, we already started. You're answering the questions for me, so I think this is going to be quite a doddle, really. I'll just sit over here, and you can finish the answers as well as the questions.
So, I just imagine, what was that like for you? Was it something that was just inevitable, or was it something you were very excited about and rushed down to see in print the next day?
It's always a thrill to see something in print, even after all these years. The print product is something else. Even though these days you can see the whole lot online as a PDF. Those days, absolutely not. But these days, yes. But even so, as it comes through the letterbox, I'm still excited and can be found in the house just turning over the pages of spelling them and feeling them.
Wonderful. I could be cheeky at the start and say, did you buy many spare copies to distribute through friends' letterboxes?
No. No. You will discover how modest I am about these things.
Wonderful. Can you remember what the issue was? There a focus for the issue at the time that you remember?
The only thing I remember is that we had a graphic. And as I talk, people will realise how old and how far back we go. I mean, it's only 25 years, but we had a map with a dotted line on it that I asked my production team to put the dotted line on. I seem to remember it took about 2 hours to add a dotted line to a map on press day, and that sort of time is only comparable with now when we're all working remotely. And if I want my colleagues in the design team to move a dotted line from one column to the next, it can often take half an hour of backwards and forwards messaging, saying, no, between columns 3 and 4. No, 3 and 4, not 2 and 3.
Right. Gosh. So do you think is it that I never know which way the relationship is, and we'll unpack it. Is that the pace of change is so much now that things have to be adjusted quickly, or is it the ability to adjust things quickly forces some of the pace of change? I tried to remember myself 25 years ago. Life goes slower, and our technology just couldn't match it. Or does that question make sense?
We do more. We've crammed more into the week, and then would have been thought possible. In the early days, we did far fewer pages. I would have leisurely ends of weeks. There was no internet. We would just produce 20 pages of a newspaper, and that was our only job.
Mm. And how much is it a bit like a frog in a kettle? It just has changed over 25 years, or were there particular compressive moments when you thought, gosh, we've got to, reinvent our workflow and our processes?
It's normally when I've worked out how to do what we're doing, and it's all become second nature. That's when we have to change and learn something afresh. It's good because the readers feel the same way, and although every innovation is met with one or two expressions of surprise, shall we say, among the readers, quite often they bed down pretty quickly. But I mean, I don't know how much you want to go into the early days, but when I arrived at the paper, there was no colour printing, for example.
I did have that question down. I think, did you oversee the introduction of colour images?
That's right. Yeah, it was when I was interviewed for the job. I think my one innovation was to say, well, I'd quite like some colour in the paper, please. And this was such a spectacular idea that I got the job. And I think the first colour we used was mud. Vague, different. It was a really bad piece of printing, but it was, and we could only have colour on certain pages, most of which were advertising pages, I seem to remember. So it was an odd introduction, but you got there in the end.
Fantastic. So Paul, it's difficult to think of another publication whose editor has got such a long perspective, and I want to ask you some questions about that. But if we can start now with your childhood, as this is a kind of oral history, could you tell us where and when you were born?
Gosh, I was born in Dunstable in Bedfordshire.
No, sorry, I have to stop there.
Okay.
Dunstable. Now, I didn't know that. This is not in my research notes. I was born in the Luton and Dunstable Hospital, and my grandparents lived in Dunstable. So
well, I never.
We can't go down memory lane, but please tell me where in Dunstable.
Well, I have to say I can't really give you much information about that because I left when I was about 1.5.
Ah, okay.
Yeah, my parents had a new house built near the Downs, and not very much money. Instead of a child seat, there was an orange box in the back of the van that I was carted around. Having sampled the delights of Dunstable, didn't take long.
Quickly moved on. Now, I can. When you say new houses at Dunstable Downs, I can imagine. I know exactly where you mean.
Sorry, so I've just offended half my readers. We moved to a petrol station just outside Colchester.
Oh gosh.
In Essex. So I grew up on a petrol station.
So that was a move with work, your parents' work, was it?
Yeah, my father started out as a teacher, and they decided that they would go into business and sell petrol.
Oh my goodness, that was a change. Thank you. So we found it really helpful in these interviews to go back 2 generations to grandparents. It gives us a depth to family. So could you tell us a little bit about your grandparents on both sides of your family? Anything that comes to mind about who they were, what they did, and what you remember about them?
My father's family, I knew almost nothing about. They all came down from Hull. I'm the first generation in my family to call it Hull, obviously. And they moved to the Essex borders during the war. My maternal grandfather was an electrical engineer, and he had 3 daughters, which was much to his sadness because he wanted a rugby player as an offspring, and so in a sense the family that I grew up with was very maternal because my grandmother was a strong Yorkshire woman, and her 3 daughters, we all came together at Christmas, had 3 Christmas days, one after the other for some odd reason. And it was the typical family with the men sitting in the armchairs with the hands and the women running it all. So no religion. My grandfather was a churchgoer, but it was he was a club man. It was a sort of club that he went to, I think. And both my parents were very. My father's very anti, so didn't feature in my childhood.
Hey, Paul, it's been a consistent thing in the interviews with people. I'm in my 50s, a little younger than you, but sort of seeing a pattern of a diaspora, people moving from the north of England during the Second World War or after. My grandparents did the same.
Oh, that's interesting.
Were Catholics, but then abandoned their Catholicism such that I never have any recollection of it at all as a child. In fact, my father was very anti-church and anti-faith, and there seems to be some people. There's a continuity as they move. You know, there's been Brethren, Catholics, Anglicans, a similar sort of pattern. So there's been these continuities or these disjunctions between their grandparents' faith. It's been fascinating. So with your grandparents, not a particular faith tradition that they were involved in, other than one of them you said is a kind of club.
Yes, I mean, I think as a child he once took me into a church because he had to deliver something to the organist or something. But that was my only encounter. And it's always very helpful for me to remember that religion and Christianity isn't something people have rejected. It's not something they've considered, weighed in the balance, and come down on one side or the other. It's perfectly easy to function in the supposedly Christian country and not come across it at all. But I was an incurious child, so it could just be me.
Yeah, no, I mean, I didn't step foot into a church other than family funerals or weddings until I was almost 17. And, you know, my parents had just, you know, vacated all references to Christianity. It was a surprise to me to find out that what Christians were, other than funerals and Christmas. But so, Paul, that's fascinating. Sometimes, if we move on to your parents, sometimes we find that parents can be quite different temperamentally. Was that true of your parents? And can you tell us a bit about your mother and father? Like, where did they meet and what did they do?
It was slightly odd because they were their second cousins. So when and knew each other from infancy. And my mother was worked for the Met Office, and my father, as I say, was a teacher. He was a science teacher in the early days. And then they went into business together with my aunt and uncle. So I had 4 adults around me and my sister as I was growing up, and it was quite a lovely childhood because my parents worked from home, as it were. So I mean, apart from the fact that there's instilled in me is this Pavlovian response to any bell I hear, because when the bell went off, you had to run out and serve petrol. Not even before I was old enough to do that. Nonetheless, the whole family was jerked from whatever it was doing.
One of my earliest petrol memories was in a car taking forever to get to Cornwall because, of course, the M25 didn't exist. My children find that hard to believe. And I remember when it was at whatever point that was, it had cost £1 for a gallon of fuel. Exactly. I remember being amazed at that, looking out at as the numbers clicked around, and my father explaining at this point in history how overpriced petrol was, £1 a gallon, with a reserve petrol tank that was very expensive to fill up as well. So this is most of your childhood. So you moved early on, and so you wouldn't have a recollection of your father being a teacher, and this business became their life for the whole of your childhood.
Right. Yeah. That's right. Yeah. And then I'd been a journalist for some years before. I tell you about being incurious. I'd been a journalist for some years before it dawned on me that my father had become a journalist as well. It's just that he became a motor journalist. So in a sense, it was a different speciality. And I hadn't actually made the connection between the two. He started off as a cartoonist. And then wrote the words around it. And eventually he was the motoring correspondent for the Sunday Express, and did lots of freelance bits and pieces.
Sorry if I dig into that a little. Was that just accidental, a hobby that turned into something, or?
It was the days when parents didn't explain themselves to their children, I'm afraid. So I have no idea.
Okay. They just did things and you didn't ask. Yeah. Okay. Great.
But in the end, he specialised in the writing and left my mother to run the garage, and she worked with my uncle and ran a replacement car engine farm.
Gosh, thank you. So could you give us a feel for your hometown and local area? What are some of the early memories that have stayed with you?
Well, I started off, although the garage was on the edge of Colchester, I went to village school and would walk there with my sister along the country lanes. And my rudimentary knowledge of wildflowers stems from that. Then I went, we moved to another region around Colchester, and it's quite a military town, and so as I entered my teens and grew my hair and did all the things that would-be hippies who'd actually missed out on the true hippiedom tried to do, there were certain pubs in the town that you didn't go into, and it was small enough and friendly enough to be, apart from those pubs, to be a nice place to grow up.
Great, thank you. So, what was your family's attitude to Christianity? Did it stay pretty much the same for the whole of your childhood, or?
Yes, I mean, I remembered a while ago that school religion had an effect. At my grammar school, we had the little floppy copies of Songs of Praise. I think it's called Songs of Praise, and there were periods when I sang the hymns with gusto and meaning, and we had a Gideon's Bible rep come once and handed us out little New Testaments, which I kept by my bed and read for a short period. It had no effect, and we then moved on to other reading matter. But I mean, there were little snatches of religion there.
When you say no effect, was it just you had broad reading interests and it was something that was there, or do you remember any interest as you read it?
Oh, it's a sketchy memory, but I remember being sincere about it. But there was I had no community or no encouragement from anybody else. It was a very sort of private experiment, I suppose.
Okay, thank you. So, I mean, how would you? I guess the question I'm asking, I have a particular memory, I don't know why. One time outside a church, after being on a Cub Scout trip somewhere, looking at the sign and the service times, and my mother said, "You don't want to go in there, it's full of hypocrites." I remember thinking, firstly, what is a hypocrite? And then it just stuck with me for the rest of my life. My mother, my parents had this complete acerbic attitude towards Christians that, of course, I imbibed, and said, "Well, church is full of hypocrites." But
it is true, I have to say. But I mean, that's
yes, I found that out very quickly. But what was your parents' demeanour towards religion at all? Was it just
none? There was a redundant church that my mother used to walk past when she walked the dog. Pretty building on the outside, never any interest in going in. And it just was not mentioned.
Oh, okay. So could you tell us now a little bit about junior and secondary school? What was...
Gosh, you do go back.
Yeah, we do. It's what makes us us, isn't it? For good or bad, unless you don't want to go back there.
Well, I can't think of anything remotely interesting to say about much. I went to junior school. I went to a grammar school, and the junior school I went to a village school and then a town school, and thrived well enough to pass 11 plus, and unlike my sister who didn't, and therefore in those gloriously equal days I had a good education and she didn't. But essentially my education taught me how to be complacent, I think. The whole of it was possibly the school, possibly the times, but there's the message of privilege, which unlike a private school, there's always that tape that you've bought your privilege, whereas a grammar school, you somehow earned it by your own intellectual superiority. Consequently, quite a few of us failed exams and went to university and then dropped out and so on. It was a fairly pathetic bunch, really.
So my next question was going to be, was there anything you excelled at school that you can remember, apart from complacency? Was there anything else you excelled at?
Well, I obviously I enjoyed English and writing, and I wish I could say that the lunchtime trips to the pub were the cause of my downfall, and that I didn't really try, but I did try. I tried really hard to pass my exams and didn't do very well. So concluded that I wasn't trying hard enough. Essentially, I think I wouldn't be able to accept that I wasn't clever enough to do well. So I realised it was a question of effort.
And any characters, teachers, mentors, anybody that was important to you in that period that stand out?
Oh, we had a head teacher was a Blake expert, and again we were an ill-disciplined bunch, really, and there were a few swaps, but not very many, and there were the smokers in the bike sheds, and rather more of those, and I sort of shuttled between the two, really, in an attempt to make everybody like me. Again, I'm not in a position to say whether that was successful or not. But there were some good teachers, and we didn't get the best out of them. That was it was a very successful minor poet who taught English, and his job was to teach us grammar, because there you are at a grammar school, we got to about 14 and knew no grammar at all. He thought this was such an unpleasant paradox that he drummed it into us, which actually was quite useful. I'm still a little shaky on gerunds, but other than that, better than I was. But I bore my children with saying that it was failure that was the most successful thing of that period. By failing my A levels, not completely but fairly rubbishly, I took myself in hand, and went to the local tech college and retook them the following year. And even then, I didn't get to the university I wanted to go to. I was going to, I got an offer of a place in Liverpool, and again I did better in my exams, but not as well as I should have done. And so ended up at Goldsmith College in London, which in those days was pulling itself up by its bootstraps, and I mean now it's a hugely prestigious place to go. Really cool, actually.
Tell everyone you went to Goldsmiths. We're all impressed now. It's fantastic.
Yeah, you see. Yeah. But you see, if I hadn't flunked on my exams, if I'd gone where I intended to go, then I wouldn't have met the children's mother, and then they wouldn't exist, and so on. Its failure is the making not only of me but of them.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you for sharing a little bit about that. It helps us understand what made you you. Now, in a Guardian article, you referred to your, I think this is a direct quote here, impressionable, moody, atheist teenage years. Well, what else were the influences on you that produced this? Self-generated.
Gosh, you're reading things I don't even remember writing. Oh God, one is so unformed in those years, and music was the chief thing of those days, and so growing up with rock music, it was just the time when rock music was becoming self-indulgent. It was just before then. I went to quite a few pop concerts, rock concerts. One I remember in it was the Oval. They clearly didn't respect their wicket very much, and they needed the money. So they had I think it was the Melody Maker, new artists, and they had Emerson, Lake and Palmer, and Genesis, and a few. And I remember the occasion because I took a penknife with me because one carried these things, and there was a chap sitting. We were all sitting on the grass in the hot sunshine. Sat in front of me, had this seed cake that he wanted to cut up, and I lent him my penknife, and he gave me a piece of this seed cake in response. And after about half an hour, I started feeling very woozy. So in the end, I staggered back to the first aid tent, and they said, "Okay, come on. He's very young, isn't he? What have you taken? Tell us what you've taken." I said, "I've just had a piece of seed cake. That's just a piece of cake." Orange juice.
Fantastic. So, yeah, I'm getting it's a wonderful picture we're getting here of your of just sort of moving through life, your complacency. But you did say it was the failure of your exam. You used a phrase, "I took myself in hand," which is quite an active. That's an active change. If I could just ask you what it was like, that sort of self-awareness at that age to take yourself to task, and do you remember what you took yourself in hand for? What things were you saying to yourself about who you wanted to be and what you wanted to do from that moment onwards?
I think short views of everything. I mean, I didn't have an ambition, but I'm very good at sticking to a task, I suppose. So when I went to the local tech college, we had two history lecturers, one doing European, one doing English. One was super, and the other one was hard work. And out of about 20 of us, people slowly drifted away and didn't turn up. And in the end, there were just two, me and my mate, who would go to the poor lecturers one, partly because out of sympathy, we thought that this really insulting to this person who was putting the effort in, even though he wasn't doing it very well. On reflection, probably, if we'd not turned up, he could have gone and had a coffee or something. But as it was, we sat there attentively, and so I did well in the history exam because simply by turning up, maybe. And this is probably an insight into my church going too. Turning up is just what you do, and you don't go with any expectations. And that's all I think God wants of you, just to turn up, as the years go by, I used to be a terrible fidget. I can now sit still. So turning up and sitting still I'm good at. I don't have a great ambition to do anything spectacular, but sitting still in a church is okay. I can do it.
Right. So when did that turning up begin for you? Because obviously there's this absence of church life. It must have begun at some point with the fidgeting, I assume. But when did that begin?
Well, it was love, of course, not love of the Lord, but of love of the one of the attractive girls opposite me at Goldsmith College, standing in the corridor that first week, and very soon we were an item. And she then, rather after a few weeks, she said, rather embarrassed and rather ashamed, saying, "Well, actually, on Sundays I quite like to go to church. Would you? It's a bit lonely going without you. Would you like to come?" And being putty in her hands, I said, "Yeah, don't expect me to believe any of it, but I'll come." And so this was in Islington. We lived in Islington in a basement flat, and then commuted down to Goldsmiths in South London. And the church we went to was St Mary's Islington, which was a cathedral of evangelicalism throughout the 60s and 70s.
Oh, what's that? Wow. So you started to turn up and didn't stop. Is that the?
Yeah, and the priest at the time, probably wouldn't have called himself a priest, was very wise, gentle man who just let things take their time, and eventually I started going to him to find out what it was all about. We go to his study for hour-long sessions every week. And he'd say, well, normally I give people Mark's Gospel to read first, but I think I could start you with John. And of course, that was hugely flattering. So I thought, oh, he's got me down as one of the John people. That's super. So,
Great. What was that? Can I just lean into that a little bit? Did you take the Gospel of John home and read it? What was it like as you were reading the Bible this time?
Yeah, I took it seriously, and I read it like a novel, really, fairly unquestioningly. I mean, it all seemed to make sense as long as you didn't ask too many questions of it. I mean, miracles, yeah, whatever. Just as I describe myself as putty in my future wife's hands, well, I was putty in God's hands, really. I was very.
Oh, well, that was going to be my next question. So, did this trajectory continue in parallel? The beautiful woman and an exploration of faith, but sounds like they did.
Yeah. Yes, and I got baptized and confirmed at the same time, and my parents came out of loyalty to me, and were absolutely horrified. I think my father stayed in the church building while it was going on, but I think my mother had to hang on to him. So that was halfway during our time as students, and then and those we were living together fairly quickly, and this was a bit of a problem for the church, because I'd served on the PCC for a year, I think, because they were obviously after keen young people. But I wasn't at the meeting where our relationship was discussed, because apparently the vicar was asked, how could people who were living in sin part of this church. And very wisely, he never mentioned that to us, because had we known, then we were out of the door and never to return. But he said, don't worry. And he had a little word with me saying, what are your intentions? And I said, well, we're students. We're besotted with each other, but we can't afford to get married. Well, as long as you, I'll tell that to the others. And as long as you intend to marry, I think that's married in God's eyes, which was quite heavy. But yeah, so 3 weeks after stopping being students, we got married there with no money at all. All the fees were waived. Parishioners and friends and family all bought things for the reception.
So how many years are you married now? Or so many you can't remember.
Yeah, we married in 1980. So,
congratulations.
Yeah,
I was engaged at 19, married at 21. I have lots of friends who say to me, my wife's a church pastor as well now, minister. Friends say, how, and we just had 30 years of marriage. They say, how do you do that? I said, start young. Yeah.
Well, my wife had her 21st birthday on our honeymoon.
Fantastic.
Yeah. If it's right, then it's fantastic.
Yeah. Sorry, a whole side conversation that we haven't got time for today. How much you change in that period over time and with each other. One of my children, when they were younger, looked at a wedding photo of my wife and I and said, Mummy, who's that man with you? My wife has changed very little. I've changed considerably in many ways over time. Oh, what a wonderful, wonderful story. If I could just again lean in a little bit, you said, your father, you just painted a picture of your parents there. Sounds like they can contain themselves and your father. Did you have to have a conversation afterwards, or was it just something you didn't talk about? My brother has become a Christian much later in life, and his wife's parents deal with this by never talking about anything that ever happens to them. My brother described it as someone could die in the room and they would step over them as if they weren't there. It's that sort of response. That's their way of dealing with religion, which they just can't cope with. But so what was your, can you tell me a little bit more about how you navigated that with your parents?
Well, my mother ended up as the referee. My father was the one. But frankly, I saw no point in arguing. I don't think there's any point in arguing about religion. You can never argue anybody into the kingdom. So I was perfectly happy to visit my parents and talk about the weather or Arsenal or whatever. But my father would bring it up endlessly, and so most of the conversation was just me trying to shut it all down. I never tried to score points or convince him, because that wasn't what he was about.
Right. They didn't think it was something you would grow out of, or a phase you were going through, or nothing like that?
Oh, I'm sure, yes. And my father would he would both be proud that I was a journalist and ashamed that I was a religious journalist.
Gosh, what a tension to manage. Yeah, that must have been interesting. Your 3 Christmases must have become interesting at some point. If they were
we developed a social conscience, my wife and I, so that instead of enduring a completely religionless Christmas, we would go and help at the Mayor of Islington's Christmas lunch as a reason to. And these are all the things that young couples negotiate. Christmas is. I have no idea what this Christmas is going to be like, given that extra element of restriction.
Yeah, gosh. Now, could you tell us how you came to work as a freelancer at the Church of England newspaper? How did that happen?
I graduated. I didn't want to have anything to do with academia. I didn't want to have anything to do with writing, really, and applied for various jobs unsuccessfully. I thought, well, I could try a bit of freelance work, and didn't do very well. I'm not very good at selling myself until the curate at church at Mary's Institute was responsible for the book reviews of the Church of England newspaper. And so he put me in touch, and they sent me off to do something. And slowly the work built up. They had a single reporter who worked up north and never did any work, as far as I could tell. And eventually they could tell that too. And so he was eased out, and I was offered a job. So I became a staffer.
Ah. And what was your degree in, by the way, Paul? I didn't.
It was in English.
In English.
English literature.
So this wasn't a burning career. You just accidentally fell into doing some book reviews that turned into a staff role.
Well, it was news reporting almost immediately, and again I needed some heavy subbing because what the style that you learn at university is never to express an opinion and never say anything definite. Well, expressing an opinion is not good, obviously, as a journalist, but there are ways and means. But it took a while for me to learn how to actually write a short sentence and a short paragraph. I never. It's very embarrassing that all the journalists I employ now are far more qualified than I am. They've all done journalism degree courses and so on. I'm completely untaught.
Wow. I think when you were still relatively young, in these early days, that you left and engaged in an experiment with living in a religious community. Is that right?
Yeah, I did 5 years at the Church of England newspaper, and as a keen young man who's looking for developing my career, and especially when we had our first child. We were living by then in a maisonette on the Holloway Road, which is the start of the A1 for anybody who knows London. So it was a fairly unhealthy place to bring up a child, and there's a cafe opposite, and the lorries would park outside our house at the weekend, because waiting for the markets in London to open the following morning, and go across the cafe, and the refrigeration units would be level with our living room. And it was that sort of life. And we talked to a Franciscan friend of ours who said, "Oh, you want to go and talk to Robert van der Weyer up in Little Gidding. He's good at thinking around problems." So we went up for a weekend, and by the end of the weekend, Robert van der Weyer had persuaded us to join the community. I discovered afterwards that our Franciscan friend was a bit horrified at this. He hadn't actually had that as an intention, but yeah, we were looking to get out of London. We were looking for a way of living our Christianity more completely. It wasn't. It was, and we were looking for a spirituality that embraced the whole of life rather than. I mean, even when I was working on a religious paper. My wife was going to church regularly, not daily, and nonetheless, it wasn't enough religion for us, oddly. So off we went, and we lived out. We bought a house in a nearby village, which was supposed to be a sort of satellite community to Little Gidding. And then after a while, because we were commuting in and out to the community with one and then 2 small children, it seemed easier for us to move into the community itself, which is, for anybody who doesn't know Little Gidding, it's a farmhouse. It's an ancient church made famous by the Ferrers, the Ferrer family in the 17th century, and some converted barns turned into 4 or 5 dwellings, and we took over one of the converted barns, and the theory was great. I mean, it was a well-run, well-organised community. And we started the publishing house for them and did 2 or 3 books. And we had a party on a Friday night. The whole community. We had and quite often a birthday party, because there were about 40 people involved. And then Saturday night we would have a short communion service together, and then Sunday people would go to their own denominational church. So it was a good, sound lay community with some really interesting people.
Thank you. And then I think around about 1986, you become my copy of the CV I have for you is you become a junior reporter at the Church Times.
Yeah. So the thing about intense religion is that it can go both ways, and so the community living was fantastic for a year, and then it was bloody for the second, and we were puzzled by this, and then a guest speaker, Kroll, who was a very wise former nun, just came for a weekend, and we unburdened ourselves to her, and she said, "You've got to get out. This isn't going to go well. This is an established pattern in religious communities. When things get to this stage, there is no remedy. You just have to get out." And that's when my faith in lawyers developed, and we managed to get out with a certain amount of money intact, thanks to their offices. So I talked earlier on about learning from failure. Well, that was another learning lesson. We ended up we had a very poor couple of months in a borrowed flat with 2 small children, living in one room largely, for a short while, and at that point I'd started freelancing again, and then got offered the job on the Church Times. They were a bit worried about me, coming from the evangelical stable, but they were prepared to give me a go.
So what attracted you to work there, other than maybe you needed a job? And
yeah, got it in one. But when I got there, it was wonderful. I mean, it was like stepping back a decade or 2. I was already using an Apple computer as a freelance, with all of 512K.
Was it an Apple Classic or one of those little?
It was a step up from the basic one. But anyway, back to the Church Times. It was in their old building just off Kingsway in London, and they had hot metal linotype machines up in the attic. One of the last newspapers in England to be printed that way, and manual typewriters. So for the first week, none of my copy had A's in them or semicolons, because my little fingers weren't strong enough. I was in a newsroom with two wonderful hard-bitten journalists who smoked consulate because it was healthy, and had a great time.
Fantastic. So you said you've something about developed or appreciated or grew a faith in lawyers. What was happening with your faith after these 5 years and moving? What condition was it in at this point?
Well, I think I'm fairly dogged in my faith, and we and any doubts about the basic tenets of Christianity were cured by having a vicar who was going through far worse doubts than I had. We ended up in a flat in Dalston and went to a church around the corner there. The architecture was sort of 1950s swimming pool
Right. Yeah.
look, but except a swimming pool would have just had stippled glass. They had stained glass around the very top of the room, and just on occasions when the sun shone, it was transformed into something magical. But every week we would sit and listen to the sermon, and the vicar, I'd probably better not name, would teeter to the precipice of his faith and stare over the edge, and we'd all the congregation would say, "Oh, for goodness sake, Chris, don't, just hang on," especially his wife and 4 children, who would have been out of a home if he'd actually stepped off. So it helps firm up your faith when your vicar is really a bit flaky.
I can just picture the existential abyss on a Sunday service that you were peering into with your gosh. And then I think you had an interlude. You went to Lambeth Palace to work.
Yes, the Church Times went through a transformation. That the family firm who'd started it, their final member, Bernard Palmer, retired, and it was the paper was bought by him as H&M Modern, and a new editor installed, and we all moved to from this elegant building to a fairly small set of rooms above a building site in Islington. Islington because it was near the editor's house. I think that's the only reason we were there. And I progressed to news editor, and then I got a call from Lambeth offering me about £5,000 more than I was earning as a journalist, and with a small family, it wasn't. And I wish it wasn't a question of vocation; it was a question of finance.
Yeah. And what did you do once you got there? What were you doing?
Well, they were after a press secretary. The existing press secretary, Keatley, was diagnosed with a medical disorder, which meant that she needed to avoid stress. And working at Lambeth Palace as press secretary is not where you want to be with that sort of disorder. So they need somebody fast, and the reason they need somebody fast because I discovered at the end of my interview when I said yes and signed a piece of paper, they said, "Well, now we can tell you that Robert Runcie, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury, is going to retire at the end of the week." So that's why they need somebody fast. They didn't have time to go through long recruitment processes. So suddenly I was. I think I had about 6 months with him, and then a rather curious 3 months or so without anybody. Or actually, it didn't work that way because they announced the next one, George Carey, quite quickly, and so I had and suddenly the press interest in Robert dropped away, and everybody was interested in George. He was still bishop down in the West Country at the time, with no press secretary at all. So got into awful scrapes in the early days because there wasn't a well-oiled, efficient team that obviously we were to look after him.
Gosh. So then this experience at Lambeth Palace, in what way did it prepare you or equip you for what you did when you became an editor at the Church Times?
Gosh, that's an interesting thought. It's obviously very useful to be on both sides of the so to be selling a product, as it were, and having had a period of that, I now know what the product is. I also know the strains they're under. I know I can be, even now, when it's always frustrating trying to get hold of somebody, but I know the strains they're under. I know what the pressures are. They were particularly difficult at the time because it was the time that Terry Waite, who was the Archbishop's staff member, had been kidnapped and was held in Beirut. So I almost had two jobs. One was looking after the Archbishop. The other was dealing with press inquiries about Terry, who at the time we had no idea whether he was alive or not. We assumed he wasn't. But on the other hand, shady characters from the Middle East would turn up every now and again with rumours and offers of help for certain sums. It was
You've brought back a childhood memory for me, because of course I wasn't involved in church. All I can remember is I'm sure I used to hear on the news on a regular basis. I remember it was very prevalent. You know, the archbishops. I'm sure they used to say special envoy Terry Waite,
right,
and I used to think, what's an archbishop? And secondly, what's an envoy? But I just ingrained in my childhood memories of this image of this man in captivity, and just wondering if he was ever going to be found alive or released. It was a huge story for a very long period of time, wasn't it?
Well, special envoy was what the press called him, because which we went along with, because secretary for Anglican affairs it wasn't what he was doing anyway. And he did go off piste anyway. But it was I remember it was when Brian Keenan, who was an Irish journalist, there were about 8 or 9 Americans and British people who were captured at the same time, and Brian Keenan, who was Irish, was released, and it was I was called into somebody else's office at Lambeth early one morning, and an interview which he'd given, which was a broadcast, mentioned that he had seen these huge feet shuffle past his where he was incarcerated. They were kept apart, but that was the first we heard that Terry Waite was actually alive. And it was still months before I'd left Lambeth before he was finally negotiated out.
Yeah. So yes, you left Lambeth and you went. You left in support of your wife training for ministry in Cambridge, and you were looking after 2 young children, which back then sounds like it must have been quite a radical thing to do. Was it seen as radical by your friends and colleagues?
Not. I think by then my editor had given up on me. Well, up to a point, because he actually did forgive me for going off and leaving him to become a PR man, for which he had greater contempt. and he. So we were in this theological college in Cambridge, and I don't know whether things have changed, but there is no lower status than being the partner of a theological student. They are generally so, let's say they're so enthusiastic and so keen on their studies that they have little time or attention for anybody else. And it's a bit of an anomaly, because they're mostly young single men, as they were at the time. And so there's a certain culture there which doesn't allow. And I also I felt, damn it, I've been working at Lambeth Palace for the last 2 years. Who are you lot? So I think I suffered a crisis of not confidence, probably pomposity, and again, it was very good for my soul to discover that I wasn't as important as I thought myself. But so I started doing a weekly column for the Church Times. I did a press column, which meant that I could. It was a fantastic press column, because I did spend hours reading the papers every day as my day job, which it just sort of kept me in the swing of things, really, and it also kept me sane.
So what was the general attitude towards the ordination of women that you must have had to? I was going to say swim against, but there's me being pejorative there. But what making assumptions? What was it like?
Well, the college we were at, it was Westcott, and sort of liberal Catholic, and more liberal than Catholic, really. And so there was not in a sense, there was no question of it being the right thing. And if anybody had any doubts about it, they kept quiet about it. I think that was, so there was no argument within the college, and there was some remarkably fine, exciting women ordinands amongst the crowd who were in most cases more interesting and more exciting than certainly some of the men who were there. So it wasn't an issue until the vote to allow women to be ordained actually happened while we were there, and suddenly it was only then I realised that actually this might not have happened. It had I suppose in the people we were in, the crowd that we were among, it had seemed a foregone conclusion. It was only the thought that if it hadn't happened then, my wife would be out of a job before she'd even got one. But no, it's in a sense the arguments have rolled around much more significantly since then. I think it was in many ways the vote was the easy part. It was then the difficult part was for individual parishes around the country to come to the conclusion that a woman would be okay. For example, they wanted an experienced priest. Well, women had been deacons, but they hadn't been priests. So if you say, well, we'd like an experienced priest of 10 years standing with a family and a wife who'll help to run all the wifely things, then that was the sort of attitude that getting a job was up against for those early days, and to an extent still now. There's a still in some people's minds there's an image of the next vicar. It's going quickly, but it's so that's the human nature element of it all. But beyond that, in my work at the Church Times, we write for readers who have a whole range of views on the subject, and it's very good intellectually and spiritually to be aware of people who disagree with you, and who the paper has had a line on this from before I was there, but it's not been a campaigning issue for us. The only campaigning we've done on the issue is to make sure that all views are represented.
Thank you. So you came back to the Church Times as a news editor before you assumed the editorship of the Church Times. Did that leave you with a clear indication of where you thought the Church Times should go before you became overall editor?
Yes, it's genuinely hard to remember exactly what was happening then. The paper was quite unpopular because the editor at the time, John Whale, had very high standards journalistically. He employed some excellent freelancers whom I inherited, and a few I've managed to hang on to. But he didn't indulge the readers, so the paper was quite intellectual and quite stringent, and quite dull in the look. It was just the time of the Independent had started up, and the idea of having small headlines and no white space, and it had a very grey look altogether, I suppose. And so, all I did was persuade the designer to stay with me and put an extra line of white under a headline, and Bob's your uncle. I introduced
another renovation from.
I introduced a
white space.
a lot of nothing. That was my first contribution to the paper.
Fantastic. Thank you. So broadsheets still had religious correspondence in the 1990s. Did that make news gathering competitive, or what was it like being in that environment at that time?
Yeah, it was much better in that religion was taken seriously, and the broadsheet religious correspondents were senior figures, and they didn't have to fight for space. Their job was to tell their editors what was an important story and what wasn't, and they were given the space to write about stuff. So the competition, and of course they were dailies and we were just a weekly. It was a competitive business. It was our job to do things well and to do things thoroughly, and also we're much more feel then for a paper of record. We still think of ourselves. We don't use the phrase now. We still think of ourselves as a paper record, but very much in those days, that's we had to make sure that we were chronicling the times in a way.
So, broadsheets and tabloids notoriously have very clear political biases and owners with very dominant views, which set their editorial policies. And you've already made some mention of how some of the editorial policy worked at the Church Times, and then with you coming in. But could you unpack a little more about what that whole dynamic is like for you in terms of editorial policy, constraints that you might have to? I assume there's lots of tensions that you have to manage, and just wonder how that has changed and how you do that day to day.
Well, in one sense, it's very easy in that I do not have an opinionated proprietor. When when the paper was taken over by Hymn Section and Modern, whose day job is to produce hymn books. That was in those days. I mean, it's a much larger affair now. They were told in no uncertain terms by their editor, John Rowan, my predecessor, that proprietors never, ever interfered in editorial policy. And they were naive enough to agree and said, absolutely not. Well, we wouldn't dream of it. And that's been the case blissfully since then. And so there's no compulsion to follow any line. There's no interference of any sort, politically or ecclesiologically or theologically or anything like that. I've got no editorial board to have to consult, which means that it is all down to the small staff that I work alongside. And if I threw my weight around and my opinions, then first off, I would lose the staff, and secondly, I'd lose the readers. So I feel very much that I've inherited a tradition and a readership and a family of staff and correspondents who dictate to me that my job is to protect and nurture them, and also that church life is so prone to irritation that we have gone easier on the readers in recent years. When I was a junior reporter, that the motto of the newsroom, when we got our copy of the paper on a Thursday morning, we'd flick through it, and my news editor at the time would say, with satisfaction, something to annoy everybody.
Right.
And my Bernard Palmer's history of the paper was called Gad Fly for God, with the idea that the paper's job was to constantly prick the pomposity of a self-satisfied, overconfident, overcomfortable Church of England. And over the years, we've discovered, and there's still a lot of that complacency and pomposity, but it's a much more delicate plant than in the old days, I think. And so, over the years, it's become more of a nurturing and informing job as much as a challenging one.
So, in terms of readership, so the Church of England, of course, refers to the established church in England, but the Anglican Communion is a much wider family of churches, I think 165 countries. So is the Church Times a newspaper for the English heartlands of the church in England? And if not, how do you aim your readership more widely? Because that would be a much wider and larger constitution, wouldn't it?
Yeah, it's what's changed has been the internet. We've been talking about newspapers for some time without mentioning anything digital. Our first website was in 2000, so we've been doing, and we're now, is this our fifth, I think maybe our fifth generation website. So each time we scrap the last one and start again, quite often with a different IT company, which has its moments. Over the years, sending bits of paper around become more expensive, and so the print almost entirely goes to the UK. But our digital offering is now picked up around the world. I'm hopeless on figures, but the print circulation is 19 odd thousand. The last time I looked, which was about a year ago, I'm curious about this stuff really. I think 1.5 million unique visitors in the course of a year looked at Church Time Story. So the whole thing has been transformed by so the leisurely end of the week when we would use what features we would be doing in a few weeks' time, and even went out for lunches sometimes, and we'd have things like staff meetings and do filing and so on. That's all gone. I mean, essentially we're functioning as a daily paper, which once a week we have to pull ourselves together and turn into a print product.
So, I mean, have you reached the point where you've gone from being a weekly paper with a website to being a daily website that happens to have a newspaper in one country?
Yes and no. We're going more slowly. It would be much easier. My life would be a lot easier if we were simply a website. But my life would not be easier because I wouldn't have a job. That's because the finances are. The print product still produces overwhelmingly, absolutely overwhelmingly, the bulk of our income. And so I still do paper layouts on bits of paper and photograph them and email them around, because that's the look of the thing is really quite important to me. So the idea that one can stick a story up online and then it automatically falls into a place on a page. I think we're still crafting the print product, and it deserves it because, as I say, it's partly it's what makes the money, and also it's what readers are still buying. I mean, the other day I got the magazine from the National Trust through, and they're on their uppers, and hopelessly short of money, and yet they still see getting a piece of print to their supporters as a hugely valuable thing, and it's a physical contact. This is what people are buying with their subscriptions. So so we are both stopping everything and working on stories to go online, and we're also subbing stuff to make sure it fits in a certain place in the paper. I mean, I'm very happy to talk about the mechanics of it. I do wonder if this is the bit where anybody listening goes off and makes a cup of tea. So
thank you. No, it's great.
One of my secret pleasures is getting a piece of text to fit when it's sort of 5 lines over. And the joys of hyphenation are unknown to me.
I think you might be surprised at how people find it fascinating. I mean, there's whole worlds that people inhabit that no one knows about. I mean, we just see something and it just happens. But there's I find it fascinating, and I know many people do. Like, I had no idea that it took that level of training, tradition, and experience to produce something that we all take for granted. So, but
can I talk about pictures? Can I talk about pictures? Because one of the other things that I've done with the Church Times is we have a picture on the front page, and that's hugely important to me because I think that to confine people's idea of what God is about or the church is about just to words. Although that's my stock in trade, there needs to be something else. I mean, just like music, whenever anybody thinks they've got God and theology in the world sewn up, you just have to say, well, hang on, let me just play you this, but also, I mean, visual stuff. It's much more exciting, and having pictures and having cartoons and giving them space in the paper and online is something that I love. And in the first days, early days, we used to get Greg from, I think his name was Greg, from the Press Association, would visit the office with a brown paper envelope of 3, maybe 4 black and white pictures, and those were our news pictures for the. We'd have a stock of mugshots of people, but that was basically it. Readers didn't send pictures in. Occasionally they did not. No, but also hugely bad quality. So we would get 3 or 4 news pages in those days. That's all we had, and each one would have, if we were lucky, would have one picture, a black and white picture that would be delivered. And now my news editor has 3 or 4 picture agencies, so she's sifting through hundreds of images, selecting anything from around the world to go in the paper and online. I mean, it's completely different world to how things used to be.
God, I'd say fascinating. Thank you.
Well, okay, if the people have come back from their tea, we can talk about something else.
I find it fascinating. So I wanted to ask you now about 2 sociological developments that have taken place over your time. The first one, to begin with, is, so the UK's had several prime ministers in your career, Blair, Brown, Cameron and May, who either espoused Christianity religiously or culturally in some ways. So I guess my question there is, did that provide any particular opportunities for you as an editor?
I started getting invited to parties at Downing Street, but not to any purpose really. They weren't. I think, but in terms of the public discourse on Christianity, it's I suppose, I think it needs to be all seen within the context of postmodernism, in that it's become okay to talk about religion because it's okay to talk about anything, and the reason it's okay is because it's not important. I think that's the essential. I think it's probably a very cartoon version of postmodernism, but it's the you don't invest in your meta narratives anymore. So it's perfectly all right for a prime minister to do God now, because it doesn't really matter. They convince their followers that it doesn't matter, and because so Theresa May, as a churchgoer throughout her time in office, didn't win her any favours, didn't lose her any favours, and I think that's the it's not even seen as a reason for mockery now. But is that your perspective on things?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, you're talking there, so I mean, always hear Theresa May, and Gordon Brown quoted as, just in passing in the secular press, there's always that sort of children of the manse kind of phrase and reference. And I just wonder if the press over time have just gotten so distant from Christianity, there isn't disdain anymore. It's just something they're not railing against, but it's just this strange thing in the background. So yeah, I always hear that one about Gordon Brown or Theresa May. It's more, something that their parents did a long time ago that, no one really knows what it is anymore.
I wonder if that's both an opportunity or a loss. There've been attempts, haven't there, to explain Western culture as a product of Christian faith. So we are living at a time when the outworkings of that are. So it's essentially it's like I think of an analogy really. I suspect that if one were being biblical, we'd be talking about plants and roots, whether the plant can thrive without the root, and obviously there are some plants that can, but most can't. And I think we'll discover whether the public morality and public decency, in the widest possible use of that term, will survive the loss of its contact with the source of something like that.
Have you come across Tom Holland and his?
Well, yes, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah. I mean, it's been fascinating. I mean, the book's been out for a little while, but I've noticed the uptick in interest in that, and again, thanks to things like Google searches and Google alerts. Just the novelty of the idea that somebody may have discovered that some of the things that some people may still hold dear in Western liberal social democracies are predicated on some plausibility structures, that came from Christianity, and can those things exist without a connection to that? I mean, it's exactly that kind of thing. I would agree with you, and definitely.
But I think all it does is throw us back into the days of the early church, really, where it's turned the whole debate round. It no longer are we talking about this intellectual idea which one then affects one behaviour. It's behaviour is first. So that the first thing that people see about Christianity is how Christians behave, and if they behave exceptionally well, then that is noticed, and the reason for it is inquired after, which is as my reading of how the early church was, and so there's no even church buildings. As I explained earlier on, it's very possible to live in a country strewn with these extraordinary places and not notice them. Well, largely because they're shut, of course.
Yeah, so. It is. I mean, I'm an avid, still am, an avid Radio 4 listener, have been for many years, so regularly hear politicians, and I sort of slightly wince every time I hear one of them make claims about, in England, we're a tolerant society, or, they reach for virtues, and I always find myself thinking, where did those virtues emerge from? Tolerance is not a foregone thing, and we certainly see maybe the collapse of tolerance in political life and public life, that's for sure.
On the other hand, it's also very, very good for Christians and the church to understand that they do not have the monopoly on good behaviour. It's quite extraordinary. People can look at behaviour in the church and think they still have the monopoly on good behaviour. There are so many examples of where church people have learnt how to behave well and how to look after others from people with no beliefs whatsoever, from secular organisations, from people of other faiths. I mean, there's just so I think it's been a useful exercise, this 21st century of unpicking it's meant that we have had to discover what's important and how to not only communicate it but live it.
Yeah. Do you feel a weight of responsibility, or is it just something that comes out of this? I just imagine this wonderful tradition that you have in the Church Times, all the years there, the picture that you painted of the staff and how you do things. Because obviously the production of media today and engagement in anything in the public world just seems so utterly toxic, 24-hour breaking news, clickbait. I mean, do you find yourself battling against that? Are you holding a position against that? Do you feel a burden to model something different and be different for people? Does that question make sense, Paul?
Yeah, it does. It does. I'm as horrified as everyone about, and probably more so, about the use of untruth and how the people that we used to look up to lie deliberately and openly and strategically, knowing that whatever they say will be believed by the constituency that they want to attract, and that's where the loss of respect for the press, and the press has been responsible for a degree of that loss, is a tragedy. And I'm very conscious that it's a privilege to be in a position and to have, more by luck than skill, to have a model with the model where people want to advertise to our readers, they give us money to advertise, that helps pay for the journalists. That means that we can pay people to do stories well without overcharging subscribers. That model is such a brilliant one, and that was the bedrock of local newspapers and local democracy, and that's all being thrown away by greedy. I think you think of local newspapers are like local football clubs. I mean, the trouble is that all the money's gone to television and membership, and all the things that local football clubs used to do to for their communities is exactly the same with local press. It's all hugely delicate and disappearing. So to be able to pay journalists to phone people up, make one phone call to check a story, is just such a necessarily privilege that I mean, that's why I'm still in the job. So the other part of it is I feel no responsibility whatever. We are journalists, therefore we are not responsible. So we write the story. We don't have to clear up the mess. If there's a mess, we report it. It's not our mess. And so that I do encourage my staff to be cavalier, not with grammar, but certainly we cannot worry too much about the people we write about. I mean, our job is to our readers to tell them what's happening. So it means that we expose things that people would rather not have exposed. But I think one of the lessons of the safeguarding crisis in the Church of England is that people are realizing that exposure is necessary. It's for any institution. Things have got to be out in the open, or they go to the bad.
Yeah. Well, my other sociological based question is: you've in your time observed the Rise of the New Atheists. So Richard Dawkins' God Delusion in 2006, Christopher Hitchens' God is Not Great in 2007, and it did lead to a large amount of ridicule of Christianity. Do you know, I must admit, one of my favourite comedians is Eddie Izzard, and I remember being at the O2 Arena 10 years ago, maybe, and he just made the most crass. I mean, it wasn't because I'm overly sensitive about Christianity. Just disdain of Christianity that generated a ripple of cheers from an auditorium of 10,000 people. And I just, again, it was, that sort of, in that time of the new atheists, and then an emboldened ridiculing of Christianity. What's that been like for you to navigate that? And did you have to find did you discover any good Christian apologists during that time?
We're slightly one removed from that, because we're preaching to the choir in a way. I mean, you don't buy the Church Times well, I say that. I mean, I do get people who read the paper who aren't Christians, aren't churchgoers, or whatever. So I mean, and people read our stories online just out of interest. So it's not entirely that way. The trouble with I think the trouble with defending Christianity, first of all, God doesn't need defending anyway. So, and manifestations of religion are always largely wrong anyway. So, I don't think there's anything that atheists can say about the church that we don't and shouldn't say about ourselves. It's what's dispiriting is if that's all people hear. And also, one of my campaigns is for proper use of the word church, and it's a campaign I'm losing, because whenever we get a press release from Church House, Westminster, which is the headquarters of the Archbishops Council, and it says the Church of England this week said this, or the Church of England has done that. They're not the Church of England, of course they're not. The bishops aren't the Church of England. There is no Church of England. It is a group of people who voluntarily turn up and do stuff, and therefore every generality, every criticism, every praise, everything people say about the church, apart from the fact half the Christians in this country aren't Anglicans anyway. So the whole concept of church needs to be deconstructed, and it's our job on the paper to make sure that that at least we don't encourage people to think in those terms. So when people talk about the church's record on safeguarding, well, the church's record on safeguarding has some appalling elements in it, but it's largely hugely careful and caring. I mean, there are if you come across a member of the Church of England, whatever that, again, it's not a membership organisation, but it comes somebody who goes to a Church of England church, they will most likely be more caring and more loving than you could possibly imagine. And it's just bad luck if you come across somebody who's still in the unredeemed part of the world that we work in. Sorry, it's a bit of a rant.
No, fascinating.
Ask a question.
Thank you. We're on the home straight. You've been working hard. Thank you, Paul. So, Paul, your tenure, you've been under. We'll say you were there just prior I didn't realise that until today, till the arrival of George Carey. So you've been with seen with George Carey, Rowan Williams, and Justin Welby as three very different archbishops. I'll use my words here: a sort of forthright evangelical, a slightly otherworldly Anglo-Catholic, and an efficient public school headmaster type. Those are my caricatures, but they're very different.
I couldn't possibly comment.
I'm not asking you to comment on them, but I'm sure. I mean, I think we'd agree they're very different to each other. So there's probably two parts to this question. There, what's that been like for you, just personally? So within your role, but looking into the church, what was it like to see those epochs and changes? And then the second part of the question relates more to your role. Has that meant any changes or differentiation in what you do in the Church Times?
Well, answering the second bit first, no. Our job is not to be liked by archbishops. It's not to like them. I think what we aim for, and we aim to win, is mutual respect. We hope they respect us. So any personal feelings are a bonus, but mustn't be allowed to get in the way of the day job. I think people ask the wrong question here, though. They don't. They look at each of the archbishops you mentioned, George Carey, well, going back to Robert Runcie, they each serve about 10 years, roughly. But instead of looking from one to the next, what you should really be looking at and comparing is the first 5 years and the second 5 years of somebody's tenure. And the job is such that those second 5 years are very different from the first 5 years. And the question I have to ask is whether the benefits of sticking in the job that you know outweigh the damage that the job does to the incumbent, but also the arthritic hindrances that come upon an archbishop, and all three of them. I don't know whether they own up to it, but I detect that their life becomes increasingly hidebound by the things they can't do and the things they can't say, and they become less. They might become wiser. They might become less crass. They become less effective in the second half of their tenure. The job becomes the difficulties of the job, apart from the physical strain, become harder and more significant. So I think you probably need to look at sort of early Carey and late Carey, early Rowan and late Rowan, etc.
Yeah, thank you. That's very helpful. I mean, just immensely complex jobs that on a personal level, I just don't understand how any human being could possibly endure them. One thing, I really don't like Twitter most of the time, and I certainly hope that Justin Welby never looks at things put on Twitter in his name for the tirade of toxicity and abuse that just couldn't have existed. Well, I mean, it did exist, but you just couldn't see it manifest there in that way. I don't know how. The role just must get more and more complex and difficult to manage. Thank you for that perspective. It's very, very helpful. So, Paul, you've had some eminent contributors in your time and your tenure. So this question is about opinion journalism. How have you seen that developing broadly over time in the UK and with the wonderful editors that you've had?
Well,
contributors that you've had.
Yeah. Of course, this is the time when any normal person would be able to roll them off and impress your viewers, listeners. But what what this is disguised is the fact that my memory goes back at precisely 6.5 days.
Is that standard operating practice for an editor?
Well, I think, gay sex, that would be interesting to write about next week. Have we done that before? Safeguarding. Oh, let's have a story about safeguarding. I've been doing, and that's what worries me about turning into a daily news operation. I think my memory span will shorten even further. So of course, we have had some fantastic contributors and continue to do so. And also, again, as a word of praise to my staff, because one of the reasons that so many people are wonderful contributors is because they're edited well. I had a colleague whose phrase was, "I'll just pass a handover. I'll just pass a hand over this," and very few contributors notice what we've done or what we did, but it's quite often things are hugely transformed, normally by subbing the first sentence. I mean, if anybody is a would-be writer, that's probably the first thing to go. Just lose your first paragraph, and end. Various colleagues of mine who edit the comment pages endlessly saying. In fact, one of them used to send people a very insulting couple of paragraphs saying, "You will spend too long on your introduction. You will hurry your final paragraph, which is where the interesting stuff is. Do not do this." Yeah, sorry, what was your question again?
I was just about the development of journalism over time.
Yeah. I think, on opinion, one of the things we do is we very, very clearly keep opinion out of news stories. People think of that as taking the colour out. It's not. It's just taking the journalist out. The journalist's job is to observe, and it's what they observe and how they express it, which makes for interesting reading and colourful reading. It's not, but nobody's interested in certainly not what I think. I mean, otherwise, I have written probably 600,000 words, several volumes of leader columns telling the church how to behave itself and what to do. If anybody read that stuff, the church would be fantastic now. It'd be utterly transformed. And the fact that it isn't tells me, I'm afraid, that nobody's taking my advice. Nobody reads the column. Otherwise, there we are. So opinion is not. It's not what people are after. They want information, really, and that's especially due to the coronavirus. The way of every week people say, well, what are we allowed to do in our church this week? And we're one of the few people who tell them.
Yeah. Very, very helpful. It's a very helpful distinction. These last few rapid fire questions are a different tenor and standard, Paul. So cartoons, let's get back to cartoons.
Right.
You mentioned those earlier, and your father's involvement with them, and you are known to be a supporter of the cartoon. And I must admit, some of my favourite Church Times cartoons are usually the ones that friends swap on Facebook. Those are the ones I see from time to time. Are there any cartoons you can remember that hit the nail on the head? Are they more memorable for you?
No, but cartoonists. I'm one of my. We don't go in for awards because you have to basically to win an award you have to apply for them, and I never have time for that sort of thing. But we were given an award. We were given the Professional Cartoonist Organisation gave us an award. I think the following year they gave it a private eye. And that's because I do like cartoons, but the church needs cartoons. I mean, even even at the direst moments, we need somebody to point out how funny things are. And I inherited Ron Wood, who's now a retired vicar. He wasn't retired when he started. He was probably quite young, and he always unpicks what goes on in the vestry, that sort of side of things. And then Dave Walker, who came on board while I was around. His first cartoon, I think, was at the Lambeth conference or some. He will tell me that I got this wrong. But anyway, I picked it up. We ran it, and I persuaded him to do a weekly cartoon, which quite often when you look on the website, the most read stories, you get 2 of his cartoons in the most read. I mean, all the leader columns I write, sweat, blood. Actually, the cartoons probably take more sweat and blood than.
Yeah, I was pulling up a few in preparation for today and enjoying the one on statistics, what the church measures and what it doesn't measure. Yeah. And so, for instance, so one side of the cartoon is things that the church failed to measure were the numbers of cups of tea that were served would be a good measure.
Yeah. The trouble with cartoons is that they don't. You have to see them.
They're very, very good. Very good.
So
yeah.
Keeping a few cartoonists in work has been certainly one of the achievements. I'm very proud of that.
Yeah. Well, Paul, let me pull up from here to land this with you. So I don't know if this is a slightly cheeky question. So there's always those stories of, someone turned down the opportunity to record the Beatles. Someone, sent J.K. Rowling away. Are there any leads or scoops that you've thought over the years, no, and then afterwards thought, oh gosh, we missed something there? And you can say you don't need to answer that question if it's too cheeky.
No, I mean, I haven't got examples, but that is the open sore that you just pressed your finger. I mean, it is missing stuff and not doing stuff where we see stories that are we just don't have the resources to. People often think that church news is about rows. Well, we don't like rows because we're not in a position to referee these sorts of things, and quite often people have 2 completely opposing perceptions of what the truth is, and we are not in a position. We say, well, A says this, B says that, but it's rare when we can do more than give people a voice. I think what we have done is, especially on the safeguarding, and again, there's no kudos there because we were late on the bus like everybody else. But before the church was particularly, or the hierarchy was particularly keen on our doing it, we were able to give voice to some of the survivors of clerical abuse. And it's not, people don't want to read it, and it doesn't do our circulation any good. But it's that, again, that's one of the luxuries of the job. We can put in the paper what we think people need to read as well as what they want to read. And dear readers, they tell you they might skim over the pages, but I think that's appreciated.
Great. Last 2 questions. Last one. Social media, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, YouTube, all of those things. What do you see as the pros and the cons? I know it's just a minor question to ask you.
Yeah, just a throwaway at the end. The pro, this is where I admit, the pro is that I have colleagues who look after that aspect of it all to me, and at times have tried to persuade me to get involved because they want me to see the grief that they have to put up with. And there are occasions when we seldom engage, but there are occasions when there's a perception of why we've done something that starts catching fire, and I have some wise colleagues who know when to say this is why we did things. Normally we don't feel that we should explain ourselves. If people can't see why we've done something, or if we've made a mistake, then we're fair game. I've never worried about reputational risk, because we are what we are, and generally people make of us what they do. But increasingly, the idea that a single mistake or misinterpretation of something can colour people's view of the paper is worrying. So yeah, we are very keen on social media. We've got 41,000 Twitter followers, and it's a fantastic way of communicating with people and hearing back from them, getting hold of people. So I'm generally pro, but misbehaviour is rife, and that's a depressing thing.
Mm. Well, my last question for you, Paul. So the Reverend Dr. Sam Wells, in a funeral address for a distinguished journalist, recently suggested that journalism is I'll quote him here, a kind of faith. Would you agree? And what can journalism at its best offer for society?
Gosh, well, there's a fun question to end with. I thought you were going to ask me my favourite sermon or something. I don't know. I think skepticism is can be overplayed, but and paying attention to texts. We haven't talked much about religion, actually, have we? But I wish people would pay more attention to the scriptural texts that they have in front of them, and the fact that these are accidental fragments of a story that we have to piece things together from, and so respect for what is written, but also huge. You do need to interrogate what the information you're getting, how you're getting it, and that's the trouble with social media, is that and people who see something on Facebook and it's got a pretty picture and it's something they agree with, and that's where you have to be aware of confirmation bias, that you need to be always questioning, always challenging your information and finding out where it comes from. So when we get a statistical story, the first thing we look at is how many people. I was doing a story this week on a report which used percentages, and the size of the sample was about 80 people, 86 people to be precise. And they use percentages, so we reported what they said, but normally if somebody does a survey and it's fewer than 100, how can you use percentages? So if I'm looking out of the screen at people and saying how you should deal with your media, the reason that fake news can have such a hold is people don't interrogate it. They don't question why it's being presented as it is. I think people need to disbelieve everything until it convinces them.
Wonderful. Well, Paul, thank you for letting me ask you so many questions. Thank you for a rather, I know it was long, but still feels like a cursory walk through a very long, and I use the word deliberately, prestigious career. And it really has been a complete privilege to have you here today in the interview. So thank you for your time, and thank you for everything that you've expressed and so wonderfully responded to.
Oh, thank you. It's been. I'm sure it's been dull.
Not at all. No.
But but you sound very convincing. So let's go with that.
Wonderful. Thank you, Paul. So bye. We hope you enjoyed that, and we have many other interviews with amazing guests where we listen attentively and respectfully to discover people's backstories through their beliefs and life experiences and find out what shaped them into who they are and inspires what they do. You can catch all those interviews by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find audio versions in your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, etc. Just search Extra ECC. Of course, you can go to extraecc.com and sign up for our newsletter and find all our social media links and more. And by the way, all links are in our show notes below.